5:47 a.m. Chino Hills, California. July 31st, 2026. A battered burgundy Chrysler 300 drifted northbound on Peyton Drive at 31 miles per hour, below the speed limit. Tinted windows. No front plate. Nothing that would earn a second look from a commuter already half asleep on the way to a 6 a.m. shift. The deputy who spotted it wasn't looking for a burgundy sedan. He was looking for a license plate. Specifically, a plate that had come in over the task force channel 4 minutes earlier. A single tip from a Marshals coordinator 40 miles away in Riverside. The plate matched. The deputy ran it twice because the first hit seemed wrong. It came back to a fugitive with 2 prior kidnapping warrants and an open federal failure to appear from a San Bernardino County hearing he had walked away from in February of 2026. The deputy called it in and fell in behind. What neither he nor the Marshals coordinator on the other end of the radio knew yet was what was in the trunk. 4 young women. Alive. 21 minutes later, the pursuit was over. The Chrysler had rammed a center divider on Grand Avenue. Deputies converged from 3 directions. And what they found when they breached the trunk lid would close 3 separate Inland Empire missing person cases. Cases that had been sitting open for months. Family members still making weekly calls to detective tip lines. Still taping flyers to swap meat booths and laundromat doors and urgent care waiting rooms. This is the story of 79 days. 1 fugitive. 4 women who went missing from ordinary Inland Empire lives. And the swap meat cashier who looked at a man's face at 6:14 in the morning and decided she had to make a phone call. The United States Marshals Service Pacific Southwest Fugitive Task Force had been quietly working this case since mid-May of 2026. They had a thin file, a partial surveillance photograph, and a red Chrysler 300 that kept appearing on ATM cameras across the Inland Empire at odd hours. What they did not have, for 78 of those 79 days, was a live location. Understanding how the task force got to Peyton Drive requires going back to where this started. The afternoon of May 13, 2026. Riverside, California. An urgent care clinic on the eastern edge of the city, one of those low-slung commercial strips wedged between a tire shop and a dental office, the kind of building that exists in every mid-size California city and registers on nobody's memory unless something goes wrong there. Marisol Vega, 24 years old, finished a 9-hour shift at 4:45 p.m. She was a licensed vocational nurse, 11 months into the job, saving money to move into a 2-bedroom apartment with her cousin before the end of the summer. Her mother had called her at 4:30 to confirm dinner. Marisol said she'd be there by 6. She sounded tired, her mother said later. The good kind of tired, the end of a long week tired. She said she was going to stop for horchata on the way. She never made it to her car. Her supervisor found the car still in the lot at 8:15 p.m. Keys not inside. Marisol's phone going straight to voicemail. The supervisor walked the lot twice before calling. By 10 p.m., her mother had filed a missing person report with Riverside PD. By the following morning, detectives had pulled parking lot footage and seen Marisol walking toward her car, then stepping off frame toward a white panel van that had been idling in the lot's eastern bay for 22 minutes. The van did not move during that entire window. It waited. And when Marisol stepped into its camera blind spot, it was gone within 90 seconds. The van's plate came back registered to a salvage yard in San Bernardino that had closed in December of 2023. Riverside PD flagged it. San Bernardino County Sheriff's detectives picked up the thread. And within 2 weeks, the case had moved to a joint task force because the van, or a vehicle using the same ghost registration, had appeared near a second reported disappearance. Yolanda Reyes, 22 years old, a pharmacy technician from Fontana, reported missing May 29th. Last seen leaving a gym on Sierra Avenue at 7:40 p.m. The gym's exterior camera showed her pushing through the front door with a duffel bag over her left shoulder. She was wearing a yellow hoodie. The camera did not cover the south end of the parking lot, where her car was. The gap in coverage was approximately 40 feet. 40 feet was enough. And a third, Destiny Carrillo, 26, a dental office administrator from Rialto, reported missing June 11th. Destiny had texted a friend at 6:58 p.m. to confirm plans for the following Saturday. The text was delivered and read. The friend sent back a reply at 7:02. Destiny never responded. Her car was found in the dental office parking lot 2 days later, locked, undisturbed, a half-eaten granola bar on the passenger seat. 3 young women, all Inland Empire, all last seen in parking lots or commercial strips, all within a 32-mile corridor, all missing within 30 days of each other. That pattern, the geography, the interval, the targeting of women leaving workplace parking areas, was what pushed the cases to the Marshals Pacific Southwest Fugitive Task Force in mid-May. Because there was already a name in the system. Raymond Dorset, 41 years old. A prior kidnapping conviction from 2019, a case out of Ontario, California, in which he had held a woman in a storage unit for 11 days before she escaped through a roof panel and flagged down a neighbor. He had served 26 months, been released in 2022, and violated probation twice before cutting off his GPS ankle monitor in January of 2026 and disappearing entirely. 2 active federal kidnapping warrants. 1 federal failure to appear. A fugitive bulletin circulated to every law enforcement agency between San Diego and Bakersfield, and nobody had seen him. What the task force did have, as of early May, was surveillance photography from 3 separate ATM locations: a bank branch in Colton on April 28th, a credit union drive-through in Ontario on May 9th, a check-cashing outlet in Fontana on May 17th. Same vehicle in all 3 frames. A dark burgundy Chrysler 300 with a sun-cracked rear bumper and what appeared to be a missing left taillight cover. Partial plate in each image. 3 photos, 3 partial plates, and a reconstruction analyst who spent 4 days building a composite. The analyst worked from pixel-level enlargements, cross-referencing character shapes against the California DMV plate font database, eliminating ambiguous characters one by one, until the probable full sequence narrowed to 11 possible combinations. The reconstructed plate matched a registration out of Rialto. The Rialto registration was for a 2015 Chrysler 300, transferred in March of 2026 to a buyer who had paid cash at a private party sale and listed a Pomona address that turned out to be a vacant lot. Thin. Very thin. Put yourself in the task force coordinator's position for a moment. You have 3 missing women, a wanted fugitive who operated in this exact geography, a vehicle tied to ghost registrations, and no live surveillance. Every lead closes into a dead end. 3 families calling every week. A mother who drove the route from Riverside to her daughter's clinic parking lot 4 times, looking for something the detectives might have missed. The task force did what investigators do when live leads run dry. They worked the paper. Marshals analysts mapped every ATM camera hit across the Inland Empire that had captured a dark Chrysler 300 in the preceding 90 days. Not just the 3 confirmed hits, every possible hit from every camera that had been logging traffic. They requested footage from 31 commercial ATM operators and got cooperation from 26 of them. The remaining 5 either had inoperative cameras, footage retention policies shorter than the relevant window, or declined to respond within the initial contact period. The result was a movement pattern. The burgundy Chrysler was appearing in a loose circuit: Fontana, Rialto, Chino, Ontario, Chino Hills, on a rough weekly cycle. The vehicle moved primarily in early morning hours, between 4 a.m. and 7 a.m., and it was always within a 2-mile radius of a self-storage facility on Alder Avenue in Fontana, a facility called Western Valley Storage, where Unit 417 had been rented in February of 2026 by a man who had presented a California ID card in a name that did not match any active California driver's license record. A ghost tenant in a storage unit in the center of the vehicle's known circuit. The task force applied for a surveillance authorization on Western Valley Storage in late June. They did not yet have probable cause for a search warrant on the unit itself, not without either a confirmed sighting of Dorset or a direct connection between the unit and one of the missing person cases. What they had was circumstantial geometry. The authorization they received permitted fixed-point observation of the facility exterior, the access road, and the vehicle lanes serving the 400 row of units, nothing inside the perimeter fence, nothing that constituted an intrusion on the tenant's reasonable expectation of privacy in the unit's contents. So they watched. 2 weeks of fixed surveillance on the Alder Avenue facility produced exactly one useful image: a partial silhouette at the Unit 417 roll door at 5:52 a.m. on July 14th. Male. Consistent build with Dorset's file photos. Gone in under 3 minutes. The surveillance team had a camera positioned in a utility van parked on the street adjacent to the facility's north access gate. The angle was workable for plate capture on vehicles entering the lot, but produced only a profile silhouette for anyone moving along the 400 rows interior face. The geometry was wrong by about 15 degrees. A different parking position would have closed it. The parking position was dictated by what was available on a public street at 5 a.m., without drawing attention. Obstacle. No clean ID, no plate visible from the camera angle. The surveillance image wasn't enough to move on. The lead analyst recommended expanding the ATM-camera sweep to include commercial parking areas, swap meets, and open-air markets, locations where cash transactions happened early in the morning and where a man who moved primarily at dawn would need to stop. The task force coordinator approved it on July 22nd, 8 days before the pursuit on Peyton Drive. The reasoning was methodical rather than inspired. Dorset, if he was moving 4 people, the task force at that point was working on 3 confirmed missing women. The 4th, Angela Murillo, 27, a home health aide from Chino, had been reported missing July 3rd, needed supplies. Water. Food. Padlocks. The kind of items you buy with cash at an early morning market and don't think twice about. The storage facility's access logs, which the task force had subpoenaed after obtaining the surveillance authorization, showed the Unit 417 keycard being swiped on a pattern that suggested regular provisioning runs, roughly every 4 to 6 days, always before 7 a.m. The intervals were consistent enough to suggest routine. The gaps between visits were consistent enough to suggest calculated restraint. Whoever held that keycard was disciplined about when they moved and how long they stayed. What nobody in the task force had was a specific market. There were dozens of early morning swap meets and flea markets within the vehicle's circuit. They couldn't surveil all of them simultaneously. What they needed was one person with a good memory and a reason to pay attention. Before the case broke open on Peyton Drive, before Carmen made her phone call, there was a week in mid-July when the task force came close, in a way that never appeared in any press statement. A task force analyst reviewing the Alder Avenue storage facility's perimeter footage, not the surveillance camera the team had positioned, but a privately owned camera belonging to a landscaping business across the street that the analyst had identified during a canvass of the surrounding block, isolated a 6-second clip from July 19th at 5:44 a.m. The clip showed the rear quarter of a dark sedan turning into the Western Valley Storage Access Road. The plate was partially obscured by a utility pole, but the left taillight housing was clearly visible, and it matched the missing cover that had been documented in all 3 prior ATM camera photographs. Same vehicle. Entering the facility. On a morning, the task force surveillance team was not physically on site, because a personnel rotation had left a 2-hour gap in coverage between 4:30 and 6:30 a.m. 2-hour gap. 6-second clip. The Chrysler was there while nobody was watching. The analyst flagged the clip and submitted it to the coordinator with a note recommending continuous coverage going forward. The coordinator agreed. Continuous surveillance of the Alder Avenue facility resumed July 21st, 1 day before the expanded market recommendation was approved. For the 9 days between July 21st and July 30th, the Chrysler did not return to Western Valley Storage. The access logs showed the 417 keycard being swiped once, July 24th at 5:12 a.m., but the vehicle was not captured on any of the surveillance cameras during that window. The task force coordinator noted in internal documentation that the subject appeared to have altered his approach route to the facility, possibly entering through the south service gate rather than the primary access road. The south service gate was not within the camera coverage arc. Another geometry problem. Another 15 degrees of angle that changed everything. The Chino Sunrise Market operates every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday in the parking lot of a former big box retail site on Riverside Drive. It opens at 5 a.m. Tables and booths under temporary canopies, vendors selling produce, hardware, housewares, clothing, bottled goods. Cash economy. No cameras over the vendor tables, just 2 exterior security cameras at the parking lot entrances that were positioned to catch license plates, not faces. A woman named Carmen, who had been running a family goods booth at the Chino Sunrise Market for 4 years, had taped a flyer to the front post of her canopy 8 days earlier. It was Marisol Vega's missing person flyer. Carmen had seen it at a laundromat and asked the family if she could take one for the booth. She said later that she thought if Marisol was somewhere in the area, maybe someone who passed the booth every week would recognize the face. She wasn't expecting to be that person. She had looked at that photograph many times over 8 days, slow mornings when the market was quiet, the light coming in low under the canopy edge. Nothing to do but straighten merchandise and look at the faces of the people passing by. She knew Marisol Vega's face the way you know a face you've been asked to remember. Not as a person, as a shape, a specific arrangement of features, something your eye had been trained to pattern match without knowing it was training. At 6:14 a.m. on July 31st, a man came to Carmen's booth. He bought 4 bottles of water and a combination padlock. He paid with a $20 bill and did not make eye contact. When he turned to walk back toward the parking lot, Carmen saw his face in profile and felt something she described later only as a slow recognition that took about 4 seconds to fully arrive. She looked at the flyer. She looked at him. He was not Marisol Vega. But something about the errand, the water, the padlock, the early hour, the way he moved, connected to the face on the flyer in a way she couldn't immediately explain. The padlock specifically. She sold combination padlocks every market day, dozens of them. This one registered differently because of everything around it, the 4 water bottles, the cash, the eyes that went to the merchandise and nowhere else, the way he moved through the booth like someone running an errand they had run before and needed to complete quickly. Carmen was not an investigator. She was a woman who had been looking at that photograph for 8 days and who paid attention to the people who came to her booth. She took her phone off the table and photographed the vehicle as it pulled away. Her hands were steady. She said later that she wasn't frightened yet. The fear came afterward, after she made the call and understood what she had been standing 3 feet away from. She had the rear plate, nearly complete. She called the tip line on Marisol Vega's flyer at 6:19 a.m. The tip line was managed by Riverside PD and routed to the Marshals Task Force coordinator on duty, a deputy marshal named Evans, working the early rotation out of the Riverside field office. Evans logged the call at 6:23 a.m. Carmen provided the partial plate and a physical description of the man: white male, early to mid-40s, heavy build, wearing a gray sweatshirt. She also described the vehicle: dark burgundy, large American sedan, sun-cracked rear bumper. She mentioned the tail light. She had noticed the missing cover because she sold automotive accessories at the booth 2 tables down and had looked at it the way someone familiar with the merchandise looks at something broken. Evans ran the plate fragment against the task force's working reconstruction. It matched. At 6:29 a.m., Evans transmitted a vehicle lookout to Chino Hills Sheriff's Station, San Bernardino County Sheriff's Patrol units in the Western Inland Empire, and the task force field team. He included the make, color, partial plate, and a note that the subject should be considered armed and dangerous. Dorset's record included a weapons charge from 2017. Evans also flagged the taillight detail, noting it as a secondary confirming identifier. That detail, the missing left taillight cover, had been in the task force vehicle description for weeks. It was in the lookout because Evans knew it was reliable. He had looked at those 3 ATM-camera photographs enough times to know the taillight the way Carmen knew Marisol's face. At 6:41 a.m., a San Bernardino County Sheriff's deputy on routine patrol in the Chino Hills area observed a vehicle matching the description, traveling northbound on Peyton Drive. The deputy clocked the vehicle's speed at 31 miles per hour, below the limit for that stretch. Nothing aggressive, nothing evasive. A large sedan moving through a quiet residential corridor at an hour when the streets were mostly empty, driving exactly the way someone who did not want to be noticed would drive. The deputy ran the plate. It matched the task force lookout. He did not stop the vehicle immediately. He fell in behind at a distance of about 4 car lengths and requested confirmation from dispatch. The 4 car lengths were deliberate, close enough to maintain visual, far enough that the tinted rear window would not give the driver a clear look at a marked unit directly behind him. Confirmation came back in under 90 seconds. The deputy activated his overhead lights at 6:43 a.m. The burgundy Chrysler 300 did not stop. The driver accelerated. North on Peyton, then east on Pipeline Avenue, then north again toward Grand Avenue. The pursuit lasted 21 minutes and covered roughly 8.5 miles through Chino Hills residential and commercial streets. Peak speed was logged at 67 miles per hour on Pipeline, high for the neighborhood, not catastrophic. A second unit joined at the Pipeline Carbon Canyon intersection. A third positioned ahead on Grand. The pursuit coordination was handled through the task force channel, with Evans relaying updates from the field units to the Riverside office, while simultaneously maintaining contact with the Chino Hills station. 3 different radio channels, 2 jurisdictions, 1 vehicle threading through morning streets that were beginning to fill with commuter traffic. At 7:04 a.m., the Chrysler struck the Grand Avenue Center divider. The impact was not high speed. The driver had already slowed, apparently trying to navigate around the blocking unit. The front end crumpled. The vehicle came to rest at an angle across the shoulder lane, the engine running for another 11 seconds before it stalled. The driver, later identified by the task force as Raymond Dorset, exited the vehicle from the driver's side door and was taken into custody within 40 seconds. He did not resist. He was not armed at the moment of arrest, though a handgun was recovered from under the driver's seat during the subsequent search. It was a 9mm semi-automatic with a round chambered. The safety was off. One deputy had sustained a minor injury from a side impact collision during the pursuit. No civilians were injured. The deputies who reached the Chrysler's trunk reached it because one of them heard something. A sound from inside the vehicle. Not loud, not a scream. More like a palm flat against metal, repeated. 4 times. Deliberate. Somebody who had been waiting a very long time for a moment when the car had stopped moving, and there were voices outside that didn't belong to the driver. The deputy who heard it stopped moving for 1 full second, long enough to be certain the sound was real, long enough to locate it, long enough to say to the unit next to him, "Trunk." And then they moved. The trunk was locked. A deputy retrieved a rescue tool from his unit. The trunk mechanism was breached at 7:11 a.m. 4 women. Alive. Marisol Vega, 24, Riverside. Yolanda Reyes, 22, Fontana. Destiny Carrillo, 26, Rialto. Angela Murillo, 27, Chino. Each had been reported missing to separate law enforcement agencies across a span of 51 days. Each agency had been working its own case file in parallel. The Marshals task force had connected 3 of the 4 names. Angela Murillo's case had not yet been formally linked to the others when the tip came in from Carmen's booth. Medical units arrived on scene at 7:13 a.m. All 4 women received immediate medical attention on the roadway before transport. The clinical notes from the scene, later included in the federal case record, described conditions consistent with prolonged confinement. Marisol Vega had been missing for 79 days. Angela Murillo had been missing for 28. No additional detail about the nature of that confinement appears in this account. The federal complaint carries that language, and the restraint of the record is appropriate. The task force moved immediately. 47 minutes after the trunk was breached, a federal search warrant for Western Valley Storage Unit 417 was signed by a duty magistrate and transmitted to the Fontana field team. The team staged at the facility at 7:58 a.m. and breached the unit's roll door at 8:14 a.m. What they found inside had been organized with a degree of operational care that federal investigators later said was consistent with someone who had done this before and expected to continue. 3 folding cots, a portable generator, 2 coolers with water and packaged food, a combination lock hasp on the interior wall, and taped to the back wall of the storage unit, inside the door frame where they would face anyone entering from the roll side, were 3 additional missing person case files, physical printouts of law enforcement bulletins, with handwritten notes in the margins. Not the task force's files. Dorset's no. He had been tracking the investigations into his own crimes. The printouts included Marisol Vega's Riverside PD case number, Yolanda Reyes's San Bernardino County Bulletin, and Destiny Carrillo's Rialto PD notice. Each had margin notes, dates, observation entries. One of Marisol Vega's pages had a notation at the top that read, "Last active update," followed by a date in early July. He had been monitoring how much the agencies knew. That detail, a fugitive methodically tracking the law enforcement response to his own crimes from inside a rented storage unit, is the part of this case that is most difficult to process at the institutional level. It implies not recklessness but planning, not desperation but routine. The Marshals task force coordinator later noted in internal documentation that Dorset appeared to have operated with a belief that the geographic fragmentation of the missing person cases, different cities, different agencies, different jurisdictions, would prevent consolidation of the investigation long enough to create a stable pattern. He was not wrong about the fragmentation. He was wrong about how long it would take to correct for it. And he was wrong about Carmen. Here is what this case illustrates about how the Inland Empire's jurisdictional landscape actually functioned in 2026. 4 women go missing from 4 separate cities: Riverside, Fontana, Rialto, Chino, and the initial reports go to 4 separate agencies. There is no automatic cross-agency linkage. A detective in Rialto working Destiny Carrillo's case does not automatically see Riverside PD's open file on Marisol Vega. The consolidation only happened because a task force analyst noticed a geographic clustering in mid-June, more than a month after the first disappearance. That 1-month gap was the operational window Dorset was counting on. The question this case forces is not whether law enforcement responded appropriately once the cases were linked. They did. The question is what allowed a man with 2 prior kidnapping convictions and an active federal warrant to operate inside a 32-mile corridor for nearly 3 months without triggering a unified response sooner. That is a system design question, not a criticism of any individual agency, and it is one that federal task force coordinators have been pressing since the rescue. In the days immediately following the arrest, task force investigators conducted a series of structured interviews with each of the 4 women as their medical conditions permitted. The interviews were conducted by a Marshals victim specialist and a federal prosecutor's investigator in a hospital conference room that had been arranged to be as informal as the circumstances allowed. No recording equipment visible, water and food available, a victim advocate present throughout. The sessions were recorded with consent and transmitted to the federal case file. The interviews produced several details that did not appear in the initial federal complaint. Marisol Vega described being transported in a vehicle she believed was a van during the first weeks of her confinement, before being moved to what she described as a small enclosed space that smelled of concrete and generator exhaust. Yolanda Reyes recalled hearing what she believed was highway traffic during periods when the space was quiet, a detail consistent with the Western Valley storage facility's proximity to the Foothill Freeway corridor. Destiny Carrillo said she had kept track of time by counting the generator cycles, which ran on a consistent interval, and estimated she had been held for just over 7 weeks before the morning of the rescue. Her estimate was off by 4 days. 4 days in a locked room with no windows and no clock, and she was off by 4 days. Angela Murillo, the most recently taken of the 4, provided the detail that the federal prosecutors considered most operationally significant. She had heard a second voice on 2 occasions. Not Dorset's voice. A different voice, lower, briefer, heard through what she described as a ventilation gap at the top of the enclosure's wall. She could not identify words. She could not identify gender with certainty. But she was consistent across 3 separate interview sessions that there had been 2 distinct voices, and that the second voice had appeared on the night of July 21st, and again on the night of July 26th. July 21st, the night before the expanded surveillance recommendation was approved. The night after the landscaping company camera had caught the Chrysler turning into the storage facility access road. The federal investigators noted the dates without drawing a public conclusion. Raymond Dorset was arraigned on federal charges in the Central District of California on August 5, 2026, 5 days after his arrest. The charges included 4 counts of kidnapping, 1 count of being a felon in possession of a firearm, and 1 count of failure to appear on a prior federal warrant. The federal complaint filed in support of the charges ran to 41 pages and included the ATM surveillance reconstruction, Carmen's tip-line call record, the GPS evidence from the pursuit units, and the physical evidence recovered from Unit 417. The storage unit evidence was particularly consequential for the federal complaint. Dorset's own handwritten notations on the missing person bulletins established that he had knowledge of the investigations, undermining any potential defense based on claimed unawareness of the missing status of the women he was holding. The federal public defender's office entered an appearance at arraignment. Dorset entered no plea at the initial appearance. A detention hearing was scheduled. No bail recommendation was made by the government. Given 2 prior kidnapping convictions, an active weapons charge, and the circumstances of the arrest, the detention outcome was not considered uncertain. The 4 women were transferred to a regional medical facility following their rescue. Their families were notified by task force coordinators within 30 minutes of the trunk breach. In each case, before the public statement that went out at 8:45 a.m. from the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Office. Marisol Vega's mother, according to the federal victim notification log, received a phone call from a task force deputy at 7:38 a.m. The call lasted 4 minutes. 79 days after Marisol walked out of her urgent care clinic and didn't make it to her car, her mother knew she was alive. Worth sitting with, that detail. A woman who had called a tip line every week for 11 weeks. Who had driven the route to her daughter's parking lot 4 times looking for something the detectives had missed. Who had distributed more than 400 flyers across the Inland Empire and had not stopped when the calls started coming back with nothing. 4 minutes on the phone, and then she was in her car driving to the hospital before the deputy had finished giving her the address. The investigative reconstruction that followed the rescue produced several additional findings that did not make the initial press statements. The white panel van that had been photographed near Marisol Vega's clinic parking lot was located 9 days after the arrest in a public storage facility in Pomona, a different facility from Western Valley, rented under a third ghost identity. The van had been wiped clean of latent prints using a commercial cleaning agent. No forensic evidence connecting it to any of the 4 victims was recovered from the van itself, though soil samples from the van's wheel wells were consistent with the unpaved access road behind Western Valley Storage on Alder Avenue. The Fontana storage facility's access logs showed the Unit 417 keycard had been used 47 times between February 21st and July 30th. The logs also showed the card was never used between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. Dorset moved exclusively in early morning and late evening windows. Marshals analysts reviewing the full movement pattern after the arrest identified what appeared to be 4 additional self-storage facilities in the corridor, facilities where Dorset's vehicle had been photographed nearby, but where no rental had yet been connected to him or to any known alias. 3 of those facilities were searched under warrant within 72 hours of the arrest. One contained a duffel bag with Dorset's fingerprints and a prepaid phone with a cleared call history. 2 showed no relevant evidence. The 4th facility was not searched within that initial window. A warrant application was filed but required additional supporting documentation. As of the date this account was compiled, the status of that warrant remains pending. What was recovered in Unit 417 included, in addition to the items already described, approximately $3,000 in cash in a fireproof lockbox, a second handgun, unloaded, a collection of prepaid phones still in retail packaging, and 2 notebooks containing what appeared to be the same methodical observation notations found on the missing person bulletins. The notebooks were transmitted to a federal forensic document unit. Their contents have not been publicly disclosed. The swap meet tip that broke the case open had been inside the task force's theoretical framework for 8 days, The expanded surveillance recommendation that included open-air markets was approved July 22nd. But the task force had not yet made contact with individual vendors. Carmen's call came before any formal outreach reached her booth. The task force coordinator who received the call has said in internal documentation only that the tip was processed in accordance with standard protocol and acted on immediately. The gap between the recommendation to expand surveillance to open-air markets and the organic tip that came from within that category is 4 days. 4 days. 3 weeks of a surveillance authorization on a storage facility that produced one blurry silhouette. 79 days of paper trail, ATM-camera footage, partial plate reconstruction, and geographic analysis. And then a woman who had been looking at a photograph for 8 days made a phone call at 6:19 in the morning. There's something about the structure of this case that stays with you when you look at the full timeline. The most sophisticated element of the task force's approach, the ATM-camera reconstruction, the movement pattern analysis, the storage facility identification, got them close. It put them inside the same 2-mile radius as the operation. It built the circumstantial geometry, but it did not get them the plate. What got them the plate was a vendor at a swap meet who taped a flyer to her booth post because she thought maybe someone who passed by every week would recognize the face. The intelligence infrastructure and the woman with the flyer were both necessary. Neither was sufficient alone. The 3 families who had open missing person cases before the rescue had been maintaining their own parallel operations, flyers, tip lines, social media accounts, community networks. Marisol Vega's family alone had distributed more than 400 flyers across the Inland Empire, placing them at laundromats, urgent care waiting rooms, pharmacy counters, and swap meets. Carmen's booth was one of those locations. The chain is direct, a family that refused to stop, a vendor who paid attention, a phone call at dawn. The technical infrastructure existed to act on that call in under 6 minutes. Without the call, the infrastructure had been circling for 11 weeks. Here's what most observers missed in the immediate aftermath of the rescue. The case against Dorset at the federal level did not depend primarily on eyewitness identification of the victims or forensic evidence from the trunk. It depended substantially on his own documentation, the missing person bulletins with margin notes, the observation notebooks, the movement pattern that the federal complaint reconstructs from 47 storage access logs and 18 ATM camera captures. The fugitive who tracked the investigation into his own crimes left behind the most detailed record of that investigation. Every notation he made on those bulletins was, in the context of a federal prosecution, evidence of knowledge, planning, and intent. On paper, the investigation was airtight once the arrest was made and the storage unit was breached. In practice, it had collapsed inside 4 hours, from Carmen's phone call at 6:19 a.m. to the unit breach at 8:14. A 79-day case closed in 115 minutes of operational time. Raymond Dorset faces a mandatory federal sentence of life imprisonment on each of the 4 kidnapping counts under applicable federal statute, given the prior conviction history and the circumstances of confinement. The federal prosecution is ongoing. No plea agreement had been entered as of the date this record was compiled. The 4th storage facility, the one with the pending warrant, remains unresolved in the public record. The task force has not confirmed whether that facility is relevant to the 4 victims already rescued, or whether it relates to something else. The question of whether Dorset operated entirely alone, or whether any logistical support, facility rentals, vehicle transfers, the ghost identity chain, required assistance from another party, has not been publicly answered. Angela Murillo's account of 2 distinct voices on 2 specific nights in late July sits in the federal case file alongside that question and has not been publicly reconciled with it. The observation notebooks recovered from Unit 417 remain in federal forensic processing. Their full contents have not been disclosed. A case that appeared to close completely at 7:11 a.m. on July 31, 2026, when the trunk lid came up on Grand Avenue, is still generating questions at the investigative level. The demand that produced Raymond Dorsett's operation has not been addressed by his arrest. The storage unit has been cleared. The Chrysler has been impounded. The notebooks are in a federal lab. The corridor remains. Here's something worth sitting with before the final frame. 4 women survived 79 days because a swap meet vendor had been looking at a photograph long enough to recognize something that wasn't even on the flyer. Not the fugitive. The errand. The water. The padlock. The early hour. The way a man moved through a market when he didn't want to be seen. The federal apparatus that processed her phone call in 4 minutes and put a deputy behind that Chrysler in 22 minutes. That is the machinery. Carmen was the reason the machinery had something to work with. If you've spent any time reading about how these cases actually break, not the ones on the evening news but the ones in the federal case files, you already know that the thread is almost never where the resources are pointed. It's where somebody was paying attention for a reason that had nothing to do with resources at all. What's your read on the jurisdictional gap, the month between Marisol Vega's disappearance and the task force consolidation? Drop your take in the comments. 4 open missing person cases. 1 tip at dawn. 1 woman who kept a flyer on her booth. The Chrysler is in an evidence lot in San Bernardino County. The notebooks from Unit 417 are still being processed. The 4th storage facility warrant is still pending. And somewhere in the Inland Empire, the answer to who helped Raymond Dorsett maintain 3 ghost identities across 4 storage facilities may still be waiting in a document that nobody has looked at closely enough. The case file is closed. The case